Hi, I'm Todd Jones, host of the podcast Pressbox Access. Here's a clip from my interview with Alexander Wolff. Alex provides some insight into the intriguing dynamic between the elder Dean Smith and the young Mike Krzyzewski. I mentioned Wooden. You've written about so many influential figures in college basketball, and John Wooden obviously at the top, and Dean Smith, Mike Krzyzewski, who you mentioned, Bob Knight, Pat Summitt. I mean, some of these, we're talking top name people in the history of college basketball. When you remember writing about them or having one-on-ones or spending time with them, is there one that sticks out more than another? And if so, why?
It's funny. It's hard for me to talk about Dean and Kay without talking about the other. And I've asked myself why, and is it because they're from the same conference? Well, yeah, to some extent. Is it because the campuses are 8 miles apart? Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think it's because when I'd parachute into Raleigh-Durham Airport, in October, just before the season started, to get a sense of what was going on there, I would usually visit both coaches and both campuses. And it was hard not to draw the comparisons and the parallels and the differences. And the great takeaway for me was, and remember in the early 90s, there are 3 consecutive NCAA titles that wind up on those 2 campuses. Duke, and then in 93, maybe thanks to Chris Webber, Carolina. And I walked out of each coach's office. I'd usually walk out of Krzyzewski's office with a full notebook, and I'd walk out of Dean's office with very little in my notebook. And I'd try to figure out, well, why? Oh, it's because Krzyzewski is trying to kind of overtake Carolina, so he wants to throw open his program because he believes in what he's doing and he needs the publicity and so forth. Dean is sort of protecting what he's built. He wants to protect the privacy of the players. Therefore, you can't talk to the freshmen until they played a game. There'd be these veiled criticisms that you'd hear from one coach about the other's program and the way they did business. Like Krzyzewski would say, if you put a plant in a jar, it'll grow to take the shape of a jar. But if you let the plant just grow out in the open, who knows what shape it will take. Okay, I can see what you're saying there. Dean Smith's the only guy who held Michael to 20 points a game. So it was impossible not to compare them. But I came away, I think, consistently with this sense that there was no one right way. And I think if you look at Wooden, if you look at Pat Summitt, if you look at Tarkanian or Izzo or Calhoun, they all had something about their past that influenced how they went about their business. They were usually smart enough to, I'm not sure Knight was toward the end of his career, but they were usually smart enough to adjust for the times or their talent or both. But having a different theory of the case didn't mean anything other than they had a different theory of the case, and they found a way to win or to sustain excellence. And again, it was Krzyzewski and Dean who were these great examples kind of in each other's face, and the fact that it's such a wonderful rivalry, and it got renewed in such a great way just in the past year on several levels. So it's at the front of my mind.
Well, we've heard so much about Krzyzewski because of his retirement, but Dean, it's been quite a few years now since Dean passed away. And you mentioned that when you would interview him, you'd come away with very little. Well, what was he like to interview one-on-one?
He would, because he had such a great memory, and he loved the sport of sparring verbally and being argumentative. You know how it is in our business. We'll ask a question with some kind of premise, or we'll set it up because we want people to know that we've done our research, or that we know this, or guide the answer in some way. And it seemed like every time I would ask Dean a question, he would dispute the premise of my question. But that's not really true, because back in 1947, it would, and you're spinning your wheels. You get a finite amount of time in his office, and you try to defend your premise when really all you want to do is advance the interview with him answering a question. And eventually I learned a little bit to be a little smarter how I framed my questions, but that was the consistent thing with Dean. At the same time, though, I just loved that quality of his, that Socratic, let's have a dialogue here. And I'm not necessarily going to agree with you. And the other thing he had was a real humility. I remember once he got all philosophical about, it used to be that I would tell myself, oh, if we lose but we play well, we should feel good. And then I'd ask myself, but how come I feel so bad when we lose? And that opened up this whole side of him where he struggled. It had to do with his faith. He liked to read Kierkegaard. He was kind of an amateur philosopher. As we know, he thought global events were much more important than anything that happened on a basketball court. So he sometimes would take refuge in that. He would take up these causes and hobby horses like freshman eligibility or the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. It usually would be 15 minutes of him haranguing me for that before I could get a question
Like
in.
it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly. And so I found Krzyzewski was wonderful with his openness, and Dean was wonderful in his kind of restlessness, and he always felt that the world was just outside his window in a good way. And I really like that because I don't want to write about, why you beat Wake by 12. My story's coming out a week or two later, and it has to have more context and sort of be a little bigger than that. So
I always remember, like, at the NCAA tournament, whether it be the first round or the Final Four, Dean would start his press conference complaining about how the student athletes were missing class because of this media responsibility. And initially I would take it as, this is kind of bogus. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, he's trying to make a point. And I started to see it a little differently. I mean, I still thought it was bogus, but I kind of saw what he was getting at, and it was just another way to spar with us, right? Like you said.
It was, but there was sincerity there too. I mean, one of the places where Dean and Kay definitely diverged was Kay was maybe because he was younger and he came of age in the 80s, which was a very entrepreneurial decade. He really felt Duke basketball was this like startup that he was running. And that if he could cut some deal for, with Nike, or he had his camp or whatever, that at the very least the money from it ought to go to his, graduate assistant or whatever. And whereas Dean was just passionate about any money that comes into this athletic department from Nike, and there was a lot going to Chapel Hill, that should go to the university as a whole. That should go to academic scholarships, should go to the library. I mean, what are we here for? It's not to put a plusher pile of carpet in some coach's office. Mm-hmm. And that was not bogus. That was real. And that reflected to me, I think, a little bit of, the depression was part of Dean's childhood, or at least his parents were connected to that.
Right.
And Kay was much more a kind of modern, kind of Sun Belt entrepreneur type character.
That's interesting.